Demonic faces glaring at me, grimaces from troubled souls. Why do they come? What do they see, with their eyes like burning coals? Have I offended Lucifer's hordes, that they swarm from deepest hell? How can I cut these binding cords? How can I break this damning spell? In this compilation video, I invite you to revisit some of the cases of demonic possession and exorcism featured on my channel in 2022. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Whilst it can be said that there are many cases of the paranormal that have the ability to leave one unsettled, very rarely does one encounter a truly chilling, truly horror movie-esque happening that, despite its difficult to digest details, is claimed to have been 100% real. In the February of 1840, a young destitute family moved into a modest ground floor apartment in the small German town of Mottlingen. 2 brothers and 3 sisters, the Ditterses were orphans, the parents of the family having died some time earlier, leaving their eldest child, a young man by the name of Andreas, to care for his siblings. His brother was half blind, and his youngest sister, a devout 24-year-old, suffered ongoing ill health. Her name was Gottlieben, and despite her faithfulness, she was destined, so it seemed, to find herself at the center of what can only be described as the most horrific, most gruesome, and quite possibly most well-documented case of demonic possession and exorcism in all history. The story which follows is neither trick nor treat. There are no Halloween pranks or embellishments in its telling. Rather, by the Lutheran pastor who chronicled its details, it is alleged to be wholly authentic. The Ditterses were a poor family, and so the home into which they moved in early 1840 can be described as little other than ramshackled. Located on the outskirts of the town, the building which housed their apartment was weather-worn and depressing. The interior was similarly bleak, with all members of the family commenting, as soon as they moved in, how they heard recurring creaks, bangs, and shuffles, almost as though the building was straining to get away from itself. But these were no ordinary noises. They seemed to come from every nook and corner, and would sometimes last all night, scuffling and trampling across the bedroom as the siblings tried to sleep. The people who lived above them likewise reported hearing strange sounds, although they cared little to discuss them with outsiders. In this way, from the very first day, Gottlieben Ditters was wary of her new home, so much so in fact that she would later claim that she straightaway felt as though there was a peculiar influence on her when there. For certainly, on the first day of their arrival, when she prayed at the table, "Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest," she had fits in which she fell onto the floor unconscious. After that, a change, it is said, came over her. A once respected young woman of unsullied reputation, noted for her faithfulness, good Christian education, and remarkable ability to compose fine songs, Gottlieben was now avoided by others in the town. Widely disliked, she is said to have had something repulsive and inexplicable in her behaviour, and a repugnant way about her. At the time, however, little was said about it, her altered personality being ascribed to the tragedy of her being an orphan. And so life continued for the Ditterses. They, like their neighbours above them, adopted a policy of silence in regards to the sinister things that were heard and eventually, according to Gottlieben, seen in their home. Life was, after all, difficult enough already. Then, in the autumn of 1841, Gottlieben approached Johann Christoph Blumhardt, a Lutheran theologian who had moved to the area in 1838 and now served as the town's pastor. Zealous and devoted, he was 36 years old at the time and was eager to listen to the young woman's spiritual grievances. After all, although Gottlieb had long attended his sermons, walking a great distance each week to do so, she had, until this point, not once disclosed to him the peculiar happenings she and her family endured at their apartment. And so it was seemingly in a state of desperation that she visited Blumhardt at his parsonage and told him of the nightly temptations which she suffered. They had, she explained to him, reached an ever higher degree, and as such brought her much torment. Other than this, however, she would not disclose any more. Wanting to help, but limited in his ability to do so, Blumhardt failed to coax further information out of her, and so watched her leave, highly reticent about her strange experiences, and yet clearly distressed by them. It was in December, only a few weeks later, that Blumhardt and Gottlieb's paths crossed again. The young woman had fallen ill, dangerously so. She was attended to by medical doctors and also Blumhardt, who visited her so as to pray over her. And yet, as strong as his spiritual calling was, the pastor disliked tending to her. Whenever he entered the room in which she lay, the young woman would look at him out of the corner of her eye, silent and without greeting him. She would not pay any attention to his words, and would even seem nearly unconscious in his presence, something which Blumhardt considered her to be feigning, for she had not been in such a condition before or after his visits. She was, he concluded, self-willed, self-righteous, and a spiritually proud person. Repulsed by her behaviour and wanting to avoid any further embarrassments, Blumhardt thus, like many others in the town, kept his distance. There was then, it seems, something inexplicable and eerie about Gottlieb that unsettled everyone around her. That we know all that we do about Gottlieb is thanks to Blumhardt, specifically the report which he wrote some 3 years later about the young woman, her family, and the phenomena which, all too quickly, overwhelmed all those involved. By April 1842, the young woman was fully recovered, and it was at this point that Blumhardt, after a period of avoidance, became more involved in her case. Writing in his report, he explained that 2 of Gottlieb's relatives came to him seeking advice. Events at the apartment had become so out of control that they could no longer be concealed. The bizarre trampling sounds were now so loud that the entire neighbourhood could hear them. Not only that, Gottlieb was acting especially strange. She claimed, horrifically, that she saw with special frequency the figure of a woman from the area who had died 2 years previous. This woman, so Gottlieb reported, would always stand in the same place in front of her bed, holding a dead child in her arms. Thus, this was how the pastor first learnt something about the ghost in the Ditter's house. According to Gottlieb's testimony, the spectral woman would at times move towards her, still holding the deceased infant, whereafter she would repeat the words, "I want to be left alone," or "give me paper and I won't come back." There would also be shimmers of light in the room, a phenomenon which was witnessed by others who stayed in the apartment. Gottlieb was instructed not to engage with the phantom. Whatever the manifestation's purpose was, the pastor concluded it could only be bad. And certainly not long afterwards, half a piece of paper was discovered under a bed at the threshold of the bedroom door. It was covered in soot and all written upon. Due to the soot, it was illegible, but next to it there had been placed several coins, each wrapped in paper dusted with soot. From what could be ascertained, the writing seemed to be a prescription, possibly of magic. Where all the coins had come from, no one knew. A couple of weeks later, a light flickering on the floor behind the stove revealed a whole number of things which had been buried there. Salt, chalk, bones, and yet more coins wrapped in sooty paper. After examination, it was feared that these items may have been remnants of some black magic, and so, accepting the coins, the pastor burnt them all. The strangeness, however, did not conclude with the fire. In fact, if anything, it escalated. In his report, Blumhardt goes into detail about how the peculiar noises in the apartment, most especially the sound of trampling footsteps, were so loud and so frequent that passers-by were scared. One could hear it during the day as well as the night, often when no one was in the living room. On those occasions when Gottlieb was in the room, it was worse still. The table would be shook violently as the trampling noises sounded all around her. By this point, everyone in Mottlingen seems to have had at least some small measure of awareness of the case. Not merely that, as Blumhardt points out, visitors from elsewhere were starting to arrive in the town so as to witness the happenings for themselves. As for the pastor, he appears to have been somewhat skeptical. Appealing to the mayor and several other men from the town council, he arranged for an investigation of the Ditter's home to be conducted. And so, arriving in the evening unexpectedly, they proceeded to comb through the apartment. As soon as Blumhardt entered the living room, 2 immense bangs allegedly sounded from the bedroom. In a short time, others followed. Noises, bangs, and knockings of the most varied kind were heard mostly in the bedroom, where Gottlieb lay on her bed, fully dressed. When the pastor said a short prayer, with the rest singing a hymn around him, the activity increased. Supposedly, windows rattled, chairs leapt from the floor, and sand fell from the ceiling. In the space of 3 hours, 25 bangs were heard towards a certain spot in the bedroom. When the floorboards there were removed so as to determine the source of the banging, yet more magical oddities were supposedly discovered. Scraps of paper, mysterious powders, small packages of money, and chillingly, a pot which contained small bones mixed with earth. The very next day, after attending church in the morning, Gottlieb was found at home in a deep faint and near death. According to Blumhardt, who rushed to aid her, the young woman was lying on her bed, quite stiff. The skin of her head and arms was glowing and trembling, but the rest of her body indicated suffocation. Despite medical doctors attempting to revive her, nothing could be done to help her. Half an hour later, she awakened. Trembling, she whispered to the pastor that she had seen her again, the dead woman with the dead child. Returning home after church, the spectre, so Gottlieb claimed, had been waiting for her, infant in arms, in the living room. Upon seeing her, the young woman had fainted. And so, after this, for Blumhardt there was no saying otherwise. There truly was something strange and terrible going on in the home of the Ditter's family. Anxious that things were getting out of hand, for indeed there were already rumours of secret dark magic, hidden bones, and an infanticidal spectre stalking the town, Blumhardt found alternative accommodation for Gottlieb. The apartment, he believed, was the cause of the activity, thus removing her from it would resolve the situation. And so she was told not to return to it. The building, meanwhile, was watched by the town's policemen, with there being great efforts spent to suppress the growing interest in the building, and discourage visitors from attempting to spend the night there so as to experience the otherworldly happenings for themselves. Slowly things quieted down, and for the people of Mottlingen, the affair, as peculiar and dramatic as it had been, was concluded. And yet, for Gottlieb and Blumhardt, this was not the case, for, as the pastor writes in his report, what followed next was kept secret from the rest of the town, both for Gottlieb's protection and theirs. By the summer of 1842, the tramplings and other strange sounds were being experienced in the new house. Somehow they had followed Gottlieb. Not just that, the activity had grown more extreme, with the unfortunate young woman supposedly suffering frequent violent convulsions. These became ever stronger and longer lasting, so that many times she would hardly be free for 5 minutes in between. Now intimately involved in the case, often visiting Gottlieb so as to act as her spiritual advisor, Blumhardt was able to record many details about her experiences. She would faint in front of him, tremble and convulse, so much so that every muscle in her head and her arms was in glowing motion, although she was rigid and stiff otherwise. Often foam would flow out of her mouth. She would twist her arms, turn her head, lift her body up high, all while unconscious. Sometimes this would last for hours, with the doctor who was tending to her helpless to do anything. It was, in short, horrifying. Such activity continued for several days, until Blumhardt could only conclude that something demonic played a role in the young woman's suffering. After all, on one occasion, when she regained consciousness, Gottlieb confided in the pastor that she had seen something floating in front of her eyes which made her rigid. And so it was that during one of her violent episodes, the pastor, unable to tolerate seeing the young woman suffer any longer, jumped up and, in his own words, took her stiff hands, pulled her fingers together with force as for prayer, loudly spoke her name into her ear in her unconscious state, and said, "Fold your hands and pray. Lord Jesus, help me. We have seen long enough what the devil is doing. Now we also want to see what Jesus can do." According to Blumhardt's report, after a moment she awakened, prayed those words, and the convulsions stopped. Everyone in the room, Blumhardt included, was silently shocked. Thus they seemed to have a weapon with which to fight the oppression, prayer and the power of Jesus. Until that moment, Blumhardt, a Lutheran pastor unused to the uncompromising and combatant rite of exorcism deployed by his Catholic counterparts, had not thought to take a stand against the violent happenings in such a way. And so Blumhardt entered into the habit of rushing to the young woman's bedside whenever she suffered an attack, each time mirroring his earlier call to prayer, and each time it seemed more or less to work. Whatever force was possessing Gottlieb shrank whenever the pastor appealed to Jesus. After several sessions, Blumhardt was beginning to have hope that the young woman would recover. Then, one day, everything worsened. According to the pastor's written report, the possessing force, despite being banished by prayer, returned with a stronger energy, almost as though its rage had been renewed and emboldened by attempts to exorcise it. Summoned to the house once more, Blumhardt reportedly discovered Gottlieb in a terrible state. Lying on her bed, her entire body was in motion, and she made horrible faces, her only intention being wrath and rage as she tried to reach for the pastor in an attempt to hurt him. There was, he wrote, something hostile in her, something which seemed determined to prevent him from intervening. As before, he started to pray and say the name of Jesus. At that, the young woman immediately rolled back her eyes and began to speak, only the voice with which she spoke could instantly be recognized as not being hers, not only because of the tone, but because of the expression and character of it. "I cannot stand to hear that name," the voice is alleged to have said. All in the room were terrified. Even so, Blumhardt proceeded to engage the voice in conversation. And so it was that he, so he detailed in his report, discovered the identity of the entity that was possessing Gottlieb, or rather, entities, as horrifically 14 demons are said to have inhabited her body. Not only that, they were led, so it seemed, by the spirit of the murderess whom Gottlieb had claimed to have seen haunting her home. She, so Blumhardt explained, identified herself as a killer of 2 children. She had buried them in the field, and for that was condemned to a restless afterlife. "I cannot pray. That is the reward for my deeds." A practitioner of dark magic, the voice claimed that she was forever bound to do the devil's bidding. Thus, in his bondage, she was determined to make Gottlieb suffer. As incredible as these claims may be, Blumhardt took great care to present them in a clear and precise manner in the report he later produced for his superiors, all of which heightens the incredible and breathtakingly diabolical nature of this case. After all, Gottlieb's face, he wrote, changed each time a new voice took over, with a new threatening expression being assumed. Many threatening words are said to have been spoken to the pastor, with the entities possessing the young woman clear that they would have loved to have harmed him, even if, for some reason, they were not allowed to. And so, instead, they took their rage out on others present in the room, including the mayor, who is said to have received many a knock and fist blow, as well as Gottlieb herself. She tore her hair, threw her head against the wall, and tried to hurt herself in many ways. To Blumhardt, it was painfully obvious that the poor young woman was not in control of her own body, and that her only salvation was prayer. For certainly, if his words are to be believed, commanding the demons to leave the woman's body worked. With simple words, the pastor was supposedly able to rebuke every movement and force them to obey. And yet, all too quickly, they would return, with their sinister power becoming stronger again and again. It seemed as though his work only made things worse. In this way, Blumhardt explained quite candidly that all of his friends advised him to drop the case and abandon the seemingly helpless young woman to her fate. Yet, despite what he suffered in spirit and soul at the time, he simply couldn't. I had to think with horror of what would become of the person if I withdrew my hand from her, and how much I, if things went wrong, would stand accused before everyone as the cause of it all. I felt myself in a net out of which I could not possibly extricate myself. The devil, so he claimed, was trying to ensnare him in his own pride. And so Blumhardt rose above it and returned to Gottlieben, determined at all costs to free her from the demons which sought to destroy both her and him. Very soon, the 14 demons multiplied until, sensationally, a tremendous 425 separate demonic entities are said to have lived inside the possessed woman. Blumhardt, praying over her, fought to banish them all. At night, whenever he was not there, Gottlieben claimed that shadows, dark figures, pressed around her bed. On one occasion, she even alleged to have felt herself suddenly seized on her neck by a burning hand. When her aunt, who was caring for her at the time, rushed with a light to inspect the young woman, she saw that large blisters, already filled with liquid, had risen all around her neck. The next day, the injuries were confirmed by a doctor. It is recorded that her neck took several weeks to heal. And so one gets a sense of how the details of this case are not merely terrifying, but also tremendous and extensive. According to Blumhardt's report, which was translated into English and published in the 1970s, Gottlieben suffered many physical injuries throughout her alleged demonic possession, both at the hands of unseen forces, such as those which burnt her neck, and herself. Many times Blumhardt went to attend her and found her with a new wound or hurt. Her chest beaten, her hair tore out, her nose bleeding, her body swollen extraordinarily. She would even, he claimed, vomit whole buckets of water. One of the most harrowing episodes is said to have begun on the evening of the 24th of July 1842. Blumhardt states that he battled from 8 o'clock in the evening until 4 o'clock the next morning, all without result. In the following days, still tortured by what Gottlieben herself referred to as a plague, the young woman became more and more emaciated. The nighttime attacks, so it is said, had escalated to new and perverse planes, with her suffering painful and strong hemorrhages after being assaulted by spirit-like figures for up to 3 hours at a time. Far from being a figment of her imagination, the young woman was, on multiple occasions, reportedly discovered on her bed, swimming in blood, which forced itself through her dress everywhere on the upper part of her body. If this plague did not stop, she is said to have told the pastor in a moment of lucidity, it would be her death. And certainly, the medical doctor who had been attending her throughout was utterly confounded. According to Blumhardt, he had tried all sorts of medical means without being able to bring about her healing. Gottlieben's demonic possession is said to have reached a monstrous peak the following month, in August 1842, when one of the voices possessing her claimed to be but one of 1,067 entities. Earlier that day, so it is said, in a fit of desperation, the young woman had twice attempted to end her own life. Blumhardt afterwards stayed with her for many hours, praying as a thunderstorm raged outside the house. Many voices are said to have spoken that night, some speaking in accents and other languages, most such as Blumhardt could not compare to any European language. Similar accounts of attempts at exorcism are described all the way into the opening months of the next year. In his report, Blumhardt describes many conversations he had with possessing entities, including one with the spirit of the woman who had, in some way, started the whole ordeal. He wrote that she, like many of the possessing entities, desired to be free of the devil. After talking with her, praying for her, he was able to convince her to leave the body of the young woman and move on elsewhere. According to the pastor, in this fashion it continued for a while. Whatever spirit was given a resting place did not return again. Many identified themselves by formally giving their names, which was done especially by those who had died since I had been installed as pastor in this town in 1838. Others mentioned places they were from, often hundreds of hours away. Some even said they came from America. Gottliebin had then, it seemed, acted as a host to many disparate and diabolical entities. But why? The answer, so it seemed, was dark magic. On the 8th of February, so Blumhardt wrote, a new period began in the history of Gottliebin's possession. Sinisterly, it is claimed that objects were charmed into her body. At first, it was small pieces of glass, which the young woman would expel via vomit. Soon, it is said, this progressed to small pieces of iron, and then old bent nails, with Blumhardt himself claiming to have witnessed, with his own eyes, the young woman retching up into a bowl 12 separate nails on one occasion. Unbelievably, she was soon, so he claimed, vomiting shoe buckles, often so large that one could hardly understand how they could even come up her throat, as well as uncountable quantities of pins, lengths of wire, pieces of knitting needles, sometimes singularly and sometimes bound in bundles, tied together with feathers and paper. On one chilling occasion, Gottliebin is even said to have stopped breathing and lay as dead for several minutes when an especially large and broad piece of iron got stuck on its way out. Tremendously, even living animals, frogs, bats, and locusts are said to have come from her mouth. Each time one of these vomiting episodes occurred, Gottliebin was left in such pain that she would more or less lose consciousness. As far as Blumhardt was concerned, not merely was fraud on her part impossible, the incredible happenings having been witnessed by multiple people, but also entirely unimaginable given her level of suffering. Every object smuggled into her body, so the pastor explained, had the purpose of killing her. And, terribly, it seemed to be working. She lost consciousness regularly, stopped breathing many times, hemorrhaged to the point of near death, and even made further attempts on her own life. Confessing the circumstance of her early years to Blumhardt, Gottliebin revealed that one of her childhood illnesses had been cured through the use of magical medications. Such, supposedly, had drawn her into the net of magic, something made all the worse by a cousin who she went to live with at the age of 7. Feared as an evil person, it was suggested that she had somehow pledged the girl's soul to the devil. Thus, this was why she suffered. She had been sold to Satan. And so the possession and violent attacks continued. Then, from the 24th to the 28th of December 1843, the end appeared to be in sight. But first, Blumhardt and the Ditters family had to endure one final marathon of madness. Both Gottliebin's sister, Katharina, and her half-blind brother are described as having fallen under the same demonic influence as their sibling. For the first time in the 2-year-long possession, Katharina raged and threatened to tear the pastor into 1,000 pieces. She was allegedly so violent that she had to be restrained. Her behavior was entirely uncharacteristic. Bound, a demon then supposedly spoke through her. It was firm and declared itself to be not a spirit of a deceased person, but a prominent angel of Satan. As midnight approached, the young woman's rage increased, with her being seized with such violent shakings that it was as if she would shake off every limb individually. Then, so Blumhardt writes, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the supposed angel of Satan roared, while the girl bent her head and upper part of her body back over the backrest of the chair, with a voice of which one could hardly have believed a human throat capable. "Jesus is victor! Jesus is victor!" And after that, the power and strength of the demon seemed to be broken more with every moment. It became ever more quiet and calmer, and finally disappeared unnoticed, like the lifelight of a dying person goes out, however not until 8 o'clock in the morning. Katharina, along with her sister and brother, was free, and so, horrifically, thankfully, finally, the possession was over. These terrible and incredible events were described by Blumhardt in a report he wrote the following year, on the 11th of August 1844. Sent to his superiors, the document's purpose was, so he explained in the preface, to be honest and open, and more than that, to respond to the urge which he felt within himself to tell it all. After all, at the moment of writing, he knew all too well the judgment that he risked in sharing what he referred to as his battle and conflict with Satan. For certainly, such vast and gruesome accounts of demonic possession belong more to the realm of the Catholic exorcist than they did to a Lutheran pastor. There was no recourse or right to which he could, or indeed should have followed. He simply acted as he felt was right. Jesus, he declared, is victor, and it was in his name that he had worked. No matter what judgments might be, I have the satisfaction of having spoken the truth. As for Gottlieb Inditus, a postscript added by Blumhardt in July 1850 revealed that a full 6 years later she was well and had moved into his home some 4 years previous to help his wife with housekeeping and child education. Most faithful and most understanding, she had become a much-loved member of the family. Her dark days, and the devil which brought them, long behind her. On the morning of the 15th of June 2005, a team of paramedics was called to the Holy Trinity Monastery of Tanaku, a remote location situated between the hills and forests of eastern Romania. Upon arrival, the paramedics found what appeared to be the lifeless body of a young woman, dressed as a nun and laid on a makeshift cross. Her name was Irina Cornici, and she was only 23 years old. And unbeknownst to the paramedics, she had just been through a 3-day-long exorcism, in which Father Daniel Corrigiano, assisted by 4 nuns, attempted to deliver her from evil. For, according to Mother Superior Neonila Nicoletta Arculiano, Irina had a behavior similar to those demonized from the time of the Savior. Those people were trembling, gnashing their teeth, writhing on the floor. They broke their chains, threw themselves into fire and water, and no one could approach them. That's what Irina did during religious services. She trembled, screamed, struggled, jerked. The Holy Fathers say that first man should examine himself, and only then take the Holy Sacrament of Communion. She did not disclose everything during her confession, and took the Holy Sacrament unworthily. Examining her body, the paramedics detected the signs of irreversible death. Even so, overwhelmed by the fear of God and the insistence of the nuns that Irina was alive when they called the ambulance, they tried to revive her and carried her to the hospital, marking the beginning of what would become one of the most outraging and highly publicized cases of exorcism in the 21st century. The exorcism at Tanaku is nothing short of terrifying. However, for Irina Cornici, it was only the last fight in a long string of battles with oppression, abuse, and inner demons. Irina was born in 1981 in poverty to an unmarried couple from Vaslui County in eastern Romania. In 1984, at only 3 years old, Irina is said to have witnessed her father, a brawler with unstable behavior, hanging himself from the beam of the house. With her father gone, her mother was deemed financially unfit to care for her and her 2 siblings, and so a decision was made to leave her and her younger brother Vasile in the care of the state. Irina and her brother grew up in one of the most corrupt orphanages of the time. There they suffered unspeakable abuse at the hands of those entrusted to be their caregivers. But by all accounts, Irina's physical and psychological development was deemed normal for the type of environment that she grew up in. Like many girls raised in Romanian orphanages at the time, she was tough, wary of men, and hard-working. While in the system, she took self-defense classes and developed a passion for karate, often using her skills to protect her friends. Likewise, she spoke with a deeper, more intimidating voice and only felt comfortable dressed in sportswear. Her upbringing and limited education gave her few options for the future, and so in 2001 she sought employment in Germany, where she worked as a maid and a nanny. While there, Irina kept in close touch with her brother and her best friend from the orphanage, Paraskiva Angel. Wanting to escape their tumultuous past at the orphanage and the hardships of the outside world, Paraskiva joined the Order of the Holy Trinity at the monastery of Tanaku in 2003. In her letters to Irina, Sister Paraskiva wrote that the abbot of the monastery, Father Daniel Corrigiano, was a great man, and that after confessing her sins to him, she was peaceful and relieved. Promising that it would bring her soul much-needed ease, she invited Irina to the monastery for confession and Holy Communion. And so, at the beginning of April 2005, Irina and her brother visited Sister Paraskiva, intending to be there only for a short while, as she made plans to return to Germany in June. For Father Daniel, the visit was a godsend. With the abbey still under construction and much yard work to be done, he counted on their help at the monastery. After all, he had only started building it in the year 2000. The same year, he had been hastily and controversially ordained to the priesthood before finishing his theological studies, with it claimed that he failed to attend his examinations on multiple occasions, and was even repeatedly expelled by his university. This unusual decision defied the law of the Orthodox Church, which states that to be endowed with the Holy Sacrament of Ordination, one must be a graduate of a theological school. Nevertheless, controversial or not, Father Daniel was ordained, and with the Holy Sacrament was granted the authority to perform exorcisms. Indeed, it was his duty and sanctifying mission to do so. After all, unlike in Catholicism, exorcisms in the Orthodox Church can be conducted without seeking approval from higher-ranking clergy, with the decision left to the discretion of the individual priest. The service of exorcism is thus performed by every bishop or priest. In Eastern Romania, exorcisms of those troubled by evil spirits are habitually performed en masse during service. And although the Orthodox Church frowns upon such public exorcisms, the priests who perform them are oftentimes revered as religious celebrities. Inspired by the reputation of such priests, Father Daniel began performing his own devil-banishing services at Tanaku, although not to the same extent as his elders. After all, at 29 years old, he was still young, and in the 5 years since he became a priest, his time was split between building the church, managing the abbey, and preaching to parishioners. A challenging task, considering that he believed the dangers of Freemasonry and Western inventions were lurking inside the younger hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. His rather extreme views were only reinforced by the constant refusal of the county bishop to bless the church at the monastery. The bishop wanted conventional iconography to be painted on the walls. Father Daniel disagreed and considered his blessing little more than a formality. As such, he continued to hold his service inside the church for his parishioners, nuns, and now his new guest, Irina. Upon arrival at the monastery, Irina was elated to be reunited with Sister Paraskiva, and spent the following days reminiscing, helping with chores and attending service. seeing that life at the monastery provided a sense of safety and stability, and that her best friend's life had been improved by taking her religious vows, Irina is reported to have started toying with the idea of staying there. Pressured by her friend, yet still unsure what to do, Irina decided to confess her sins on the 8th of April. Mindful of the trauma that she may carry, Father Daniel helped her ease into the confession, asking her at first about her life in Germany. However, as soon as she exhausted the topic, she is said to have become distressed, seeming to retreat inside herself. Seeing her lost in her thoughts, Father Daniel then proceeded to advise her to leave the West behind, suggesting that she use her savings to buy a home near the monastery, so as to be close to the holiness of God. After she passively replied to a few more questions, he gave her his blessing and penance, which she promised to complete before the Holy Communion. And so, early the next morning, she joined the sisters at Mass, eagerly awaiting to receive the Holy Communion. Although uncomfortable abandoning her usual clothes, Irina wore a skirt and covered her head, a conventionality which brought much joy to the sisters and Father Daniel. After the communion, she is claimed to have felt as though something had changed inside of her. She felt light, and the other nuns could see her stepping gently and almost hesitantly as she walked in the yard that afternoon. Uplifted, she began humming a song to herself, which, according to her later descriptions, filled her being. She is said to have heard the voices in the song melting into each other as her heartbeat grew stronger. At first, the pulse was sparse and heavy, then it sped up, accelerating and ascending to her ears and carrying her as if by flight towards the door of the church. Unbeknownst to her, the sisters were beginning the evening prayers early, so they were beating the semantron in a similar rhythm at the same time that Irina had this experience. The semantron is an ancient percussion instrument, one which is regarded by the Church as more than a mere cultural creation. Rather, when included in a liturgical act, such as summoning to prayer or procession, it is a way of elevating man to God. The song of the semantron makes the connection between earth and heaven, mankind and divinity, and what is known and unknown. It is uncertain whether Irina was aware of the religious meaning of this instrument, but the experience and the events that follow are truly mystifying and unsettling. After all, although she felt pulled towards the church by the divine sound, Irina resisted. Grounding herself, she became increasingly troubled by the skirt that she was wearing, her feeling so much more comfortable and safe in her usual sportswear. And so she turned to leave, only to be stopped by some of the sisters who needed help with yard work. Irritated, Irina told them to take care of it themselves, as it was their monastery and not hers. It is then that Mother Neonila supposedly attempted to appease her. Irina, however, began mumbling and continued to walk away. As soon as the Mother Superior turned her attention from her, Irina is said to have snuck behind her back, making rude remarks and mimicking obscene gestures. Dumbfounded, Mother Neonila summoned Sister Paraskiva, which made Irina flee. After the evening service concluded, she returned to the church entrance, now dressed in jeans. And her clothes were not the only thing to have changed. Supposedly, she rushed towards the sisters, hopping behind them, sometimes mimicking their walks, yelling profanities at them. Sister Paraskiva claimed that despite having been inseparable since they were children, she no longer recognized her friend. What unsettled her most of all, however, was how, when she said Jesus' name, Irina reacted badly. Upon seeing his guest's behavior, Father Daniel concluded that she must have kept something from him during confession, which had thus compromised her Holy Communion. And so, concerned for his penitent, he asked Sister Paraskiva to bring Irina to him for a second confession, and for her to support her through the process. This did not go as planned. Indeed, in a rather unusual twist that defies the very concept of confession, Sister Paraskiva decided to confess Irina's sins for her. As her friend divulged the concealed and traumatic parts of her life, Irina is said to have grown highly distressed, mimicking her and nodding dramatically in affirmation. At the end of the confession, Father Daniel prayed over them, to no avail. Irina's behavior became increasingly more disturbed, escalating until, when exiting the confessional, she dropped to the ground and began squirming, 1 minute yelling that she wanted to leave the abbey, and the next pleading with God and the nuns to let her stay. Shocked by what they were seeing and fearful for her, Father Daniel and Mother Neonila decided to drive her to the hospital. Irina, however, resisted and fought the nuns as they tried to get her into the car. Free of them, she headed for the barbed wire fence of the monastery. Stumbling, she rolled downhill and, as later reports from those present at the monastery attest, began growling and digging her face in the dirt. By now terrified, Mother Neonila called for an ambulance, asking them to come and sedate her. Describing the experience later, Irina supposedly heard Mother Neonila's words as if through a funnel. Not merely that, the Mother Superior's hands elongated before her and grew claws as her eyes enlarged and her mouth opened as if to swallow her. Trapped in this horrific vision, she dug her head back into the dirt, cursing the monastery, the saints, and even the wax of the candles in the chapel. All the while, the dispatcher did not take the calls seriously, with Sister Anastasia, a nun with basic medical training, placing another call so as to explain the situation herself. Once again, the dispatcher denied them help, being said to have instead sarcastically suggested that they should pray over Irina, since they were already at the monastery. Defeated, Father Daniel and Mother Neonila took a rope from a nearby fountain and tied Irina's hands and feet together behind her back, immobilizing her. And so it was like this that they drove her to the Vaslui County Hospital, where she was sedated and admitted into intensive care. There, one of the nurses is said to have turned to Mother Neonila and made a remark which stayed with her long afterwards. What Irina was suffering from was obvious and could only be treated at the monastery. Meanwhile, Irina was diagnosed with delusional hallucinatory flush, exhibiting psychomotor agitation and onset of major psychosis. She was later transferred to the psychiatric ward, where, due to her violent outbursts, she had to be restrained and kept under medicated sleep. There, Irina was diagnosed with disorganized schizophrenia, which, by all medical accounts, was an excessive diagnosis meant only to facilitate the prescription of antipsychotic medication. After 4 days on such medication, Irina's health worsened, with the antipsychotics themselves thought to have been the cause. And so she was transferred once again to intensive care, where it was concluded that her health was critical. Irina remained under medical supervision until the 20th of April, some 12 days after her initial confession. Mother Neonila and Sister Paraskiva paid her regular visits, during which they claimed to have noticed her increased aversion to religious iconography, stating that it would harm her. Even so, Irina told them that she wanted to return to the monastery, repeatedly asking them not to leave her at the hospital. According to reports, she also told the doctors that she heard voices before coming to the hospital. They were demonic, and they were telling me what to do, and that I sinned in my thoughts. I want to go home. And so, although she was still recovering, she was deemed communicative without psychotic disassociation. The auditory hallucinations and mystical delirium that she experienced, she was able to recognize. Thus, happy enough, the doctors at the hospital released Irina into the care of Mother Neonila. At the monastery, Irina was placed under the supervision of Sister Anastasia. While supervising her, it was clear to the sister that Irina was not recovered. She is said to have witnessed her screaming, singing, and rocking back and forth at the edge of her bed with a blank stare on her face. She later stated that she was certain that Irina was possessed because she felt the shivers of hell in her presence. And yet, Irina wanted to confess and receive Holy Communion again. Instead of immediately indulging her, however, Father Daniel asked Sister Anastasia to help her prepare. And so, when she was ready, Irina confessed her sins to Father Daniel and completed her penance. Then, on the 1st of May, she received Holy Communion during Easter service. Immediately after, the sisters claimed that Irina began showing them her true being. She helped in the kitchen, joined the choir, and by all accounts was as good as new. The confession, so it seemed, had worked. And yet other reports state that she would start crying and leave the church at key moments during service. Supposedly inspired by seeing her progress, Father Daniel told Irina that they could continue to take care of her at the monastery, but that they would need more resources for her medication and accommodation. As such, he asked her to yield her savings to the church, something which she did, but at great cost to herself. After all, as she did so, Irina realized that a big part of her savings was already spent. Thus, she became highly distressed and started fasting and praying for God to help her recover the money. Between the 6th and 9th of June, her condition worsened. Although she was not violent, she spoke incoherently and had what can only be described as bizarre reactions. Namely, during the Ascension service on the 9th of June, Irina began laughing hysterically. That same evening, she sang lullabies as she slammed her bed into the walls. Around 4 a.m., with Irina still in her frenzy, Sister Anastasia is claimed to have called Father Daniel to pray over her. Although the prayer calmed Irina, who drifted to sleep, Father Daniel was fearful that she may wake up and leave the chamber, and so he locked her in. The next day, Irina was let out for a walk, but her behavior had not improved. She yelled, cursed, danced, and threatened the nuns who approached her with karate moves, even hurting one of them. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and so she was confined to her chamber once again. Not only that, Father Daniel and Mother Neonila concluded that Irina was now too dangerous and that she needed to be tied and gagged so as not to disturb the service. Using a wrestling move that he knew from high school, Father Daniel subdued her as she transitioned from cursing to singing. He then requested Mother Neonila, Sister Anastasia, and 2 others to watch over her and maintain the peace. For the next 2 days, the nuns kept Irina confined to her chamber, tied and gagged with a towel. When they tried to feed her, she refused to eat, instead yelling and screaming that the devil had come to take her. It was at this point that Father Daniel decided to transfer Irina inside the church to conduct an exorcism. To carry her and keep her immobilized during the ritual, the nuns tied her to a makeshift stretcher. They took 3 boards from the construction site and placed 2 of them side by side and the 3rd perpendicular to the other 2, resulting in a T-shaped cross. Thus, on the 13th of June, they tied Irina to this makeshift cross, using chains secured with locks on her hands, feet and waist, and taped her mouth with bandages that were secured around her head. They would not allow the devil to make her move. During the exorcism, Father Daniel read the prayers of Saint Basil and offered the sacrament of Holy Unction to an increasingly agitated Irina. Her muffled screams are described as having become louder during the prayers of Saint Basil, enforcing Father Daniel's belief that she was indeed possessed by the devil. Furthermore, she refused to take the holy water and bread which he offered her. After hours of relentless struggle, Irina was carried to the enclosed veranda of the church and placed on a quilt, still tied to the makeshift cross. There she was left. That night, one of the sisters is said to have heard her scream, "I am Christ, come to me, for I have been to hell. I am Christ, here at Tanaku." The next day was the same. Still tied to the cross, Irina struggled and trembled during the exorcism, and was restless when moved to the veranda. She could not sleep or drink the water offered to her, and she supposedly started foaming at the mouth, which was now an open wound. On the morning of the 15th of June, determined that he was doing God's work, Father Daniel prepared to drive the devil from Irina one more time. By all accounts, Irina was calmer, although she was anxious and spoke with a weak voice. In the absence of Mother Neonila, Sister Anastasia and her two companions decided to untie her before the exorcism, as she was stiff from being on the makeshift cross for so long. Free of her chains, Irina was feeble. She could not stand on her feet. Sister Anastasia tried to feed her bread soaked in warm tea, but soon Irina became unresponsive. Father Daniel was alerted that Irina was barely breathing and that her face had changed. After listening to her pulse with a stethoscope, Sister Anastasia concluded that they needed to call for an ambulance. After the paramedics were called, the sisters prepared Irina for the hospital, as they hadn't changed her clothes in 3 days. While they washed and changed her, Irina was limp and quiet. They dressed her in a black skirt and blouse and covered her head as if she were one of them. When the paramedics arrived nearly 30 minutes later, Father Daniel informed them that Irina was no longer breathing and had no pulse. After examining the body, they concluded that Irina must have died a few hours before they arrived. This was a conclusion that Father Daniel and the sisters refuted. They had given her tea and bread to eat only an hour earlier. It was not possible. And so, despite their initial conclusion, it seems as though the paramedics became overwhelmed by the situation, with them attempting resuscitation as they drove Irina to the hospital. They injected her, according to procedure, with adrenaline every 5 minutes. At the hospital, it was once again concluded that Irina had been deceased for a few hours. According to the doctor who examined her, her injuries and intense dehydration made her body appear like that of a 60-year-old woman. And so the authorities were notified that a 23-year-old nun had died by violence at the Tanaku monastery, after which a criminal investigation began. Only a few days later, Father Daniel led Irina to her final rest, presiding over her funeral on the 20th of June. 2 days after that, he and the 4 nuns who assisted him in the exorcism were arrested by local authorities and excommunicated by the Orthodox Church the very next day. They were shocked, both at the time and in the time since. Irina could not have died by their hands, and so they maintained their innocence, with Father Daniel even stating on national television that he would have had a guilty conscience if she had died during the exorcisms. Despite this, in a press release from the 7th of July, long before the criminal investigation and medical report were concluded, the Patriarchate declared that Irina had died as a result of the inhumane treatments she was subjected to at the monastery, stating that the exorcism, i.e. the suite of prayers to expel unclean spirits, is part of the doctrine and practice of the Universal Church, based on the Holy Scriptures, and consists exclusively of prayers accompanied by sprinkling holy water and anointment with holy oil. Any acts or procedures other than these, of the nature of those used at Tanaku, constitute serious deviations from church discipline. In short, they wash their hands of everything that took place at the monastery. The investigation and trial that followed were arduous. In an attempt to argue that Irina's death was caused by the adrenaline shots given to her in the ambulance and not the exorcism, her body was even exhumed. Still, the medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was hypovolemic shock with multi-organ failure due to severe dehydration caused by prolonged fluid restriction and aggravated by the psychomotor agitation of the victim. The exorcism, led by Father Daniel, had ended her life. When asked why they had crucified Irina on the makeshift cross, the nuns explained to the investigators that it was just a stretcher and not a cross. They had simply needed to carry and immobilize her. Defiant of any wrong that they had done, the nuns even insisted that no cross shaped like that existed, even though the T-shaped cross is one of the 4 basic types of representations of the cross, otherwise known as the Tau or St. Anthony's cross. How the nuns, one of whom was a Mother Superior, a nun of 14 years, did not know this is unfathomable, and so one can only assume that they were either incredibly uneducated and thus in no position to attempt any measure of spiritual intervention, or that there was a much more sinister side to the happenings at Tanaku. They had crucified Irina intentionally. As such, on the 20th of September 2007, Daniel Carigiano and the 4 excommunicated nuns were found guilty of deprivation of liberty resulting in death, and were sentenced to prison terms between 5 and 7 years. By 2011, all were released from prison for good behavior. Today, there are still many who believe that Irina died from an adrenaline overdose and not because of the exorcism. After all, Father Daniel and the nuns have always maintained their innocence, with Father Daniel even preaching that God would punish the non-believers during a televised interview. That one of the prosecutors died during the trial has done little to erode support for the father and the nuns' actions. And yet, undoubtedly, this case is a tragedy, with the reality as to whether or not Irina was demonically possessed being somewhat secondary to the happenings at Tanaku. Despite all of their protestations, the nuns and priests crucified a 23-year-old woman. Tied to a cross, Irina was left to suffer until her eventual death. Her rapidly deteriorating health, both mental and physical, made worse by the local hospital, disabled her completely and weakened her in her battles, spiritual or otherwise. A fighter her whole life, she thus found herself powerless in her final struggle. Whether that was a struggle against the devil or the much more earthly, misguided faith of the falsely righteous, or some dreadful and deplorable mixture of the two, we may never know. One summer evening in 1928, Father Theophilus Riesinger, a bespectacled old German-born Capuchin Franciscan friar and Catholic priest, was driving to the train depot in Erling, Iowa. He was scheduled to meet a woman in her 40s who had travelled some distance to benefit from his expertise, namely, decades of experience as a potent and mystic exorcist of demons. Already the evening was off to a sinister start. An ill omen of what was to come, Father Riesinger suffered car troubles on the way to the station. His car, despite being relatively new, struggled to maintain speed, meaning that it took him 2 hours to travel what should have been an inconsiderable distance. When he finally arrived, late and apologizing, the woman was unfazed. Calmly, she is described as having said to the friar, "I would have been much more surprised if everything had gone smoothly. The devil will try his utmost to foil our plans. I suspected he would try to interfere with your coming." And interfere he did indeed, for if the case which follows is as true as it is claimed to be, the devil's grip on the woman was so strong that he never let go, and despite being administered the rite of exorcism not once but multiple times, she continued to experience milder, if still diabolical possessions for the rest of her life, with her story of possession and exorcism coming to shape our very understanding of the demonic. In order to understand the full and horrifying scope of this case, we must go back to the beginning, and so it is that our story starts long before that fateful night in 1928, many years earlier during the woman's adolescence. The tragic figure at the center of this phenomenal tale of demonic possession is known by the pseudonym Anna Eklund. Described as having been raised in a religious household in Wisconsin, at the age of 14 something changed for young Eklund. Despite wanting to pray and go to church to receive the Holy Communion, as she had always done so, some interior hidden power is said to have stopped her from doing so. In the clutches of this mysterious force, she was physically incapable of entering the church, and would hear sinister voices telling her to do all manner of unspeakable things. According to Begone Satan, the book published by clergy members in 1935 about her ordeal, she even had violent visions of attacking and suffocating her spiritual advisor, wanting nothing more than to shatter her holy water font and utterly destroy the church. Other strange symptoms began to manifest. Eklund understood languages of which she had no knowledge, including Latin, Hebrew, and Polish. When blessed by a priest, she is described as having foamed at the mouth, enraged and wild and repulsed by holy objects. Medical professionals soon became involved, but none could name the cause of Eklund's suffering. Declared physically and mentally fit, it was at this point that her family invited the church to help. And so, for the first time, Eklund met with Father Riesinger. A 1934 pamphlet, informed by Riesinger's own private written accounts, suggests that she met the friar whilst he was active in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Not yet ordained as a priest, he entered the clericate there and developed a zeal for saving mortal souls from the clutches of evil. Eklund, so it seems, was the trigger for his interest. Referred to as Mary X in the text, Eklund is also claimed to have met the friar in New York after he became a priest and conducted his ministry there. On the 12th of June 1908, he exorcised a then 25-year-old Eklund for the first time. This, at the age of 40, was also Riesinger's first exorcism. It was not, however, successful. She would be free, but only a short time, perhaps a day or two, before the demons would return. Trapped in diabolical bondage, they would compel her to smash crucifixes, and eventually convinced her to abandon her pious life entirely. According to the 1934 pamphlet authored by a Jesuit who befriended and lived with Riesinger for a time, by 1912 the situation had somewhat resolved itself. After many years of exorcisms, Eklund was quite free of the evil which had tormented her. For the next few years, not much is known. Riesinger moved away, and he and Eklund continued to write to each other. Presumably, she was living her life, free of the past, and able to return to the faith which she so loved. Then, one day, Riesinger received a terrible letter. Dated to the 16th of July 1928, Eklund wrote that the demons had returned, and that the devil himself laughed at all Riesinger had thought he had achieved. Does he not know, so the letter goes, that hell is stronger than heaven, that there are more in hell than heaven? Later on in the letter, Eklund added that the devil had told her that he would make life so disagreeable for me that I will gladly turn to a life of sin. And so Riesinger knew that he had to aid his penitent once again. Throughout his relationship with Eklund, Riesinger was extremely concerned with both her spiritual and physical safety. Already she had suffered much, and so, with her body still plagued by demons and unwanted sinful designs, he knew he needed a place where he could work that would not draw attention. With the permission of the bishop, the small town of Erling in Iowa was chosen, with it said that Eklund had relatives nearby who knew the local pastor. Riesinger, a Capuchin Franciscan, turned to the convent of the Franciscan sisters for help, and with the consent of the Mother Superior had Eklund moved there for exorcism. And so we return to the train station in Erling. Far from being two strangers meeting for the first time, Eklund and Riesinger greeted each other as old, peculiar friends, bound together by evil. The following day, after spending the night at the convent, a large room was made ready for the deliverance of the rite. Eklund was placed firmly upon the mattress of an iron bed, and upon the advice of the friar had her arm sleeves and her dress tightly bound so as to prevent any devilish tricks. The strongest nuns in the convent were called to help. It was suspected that, once the prayers began, the demon-plagued woman would try to attack Riesinger, and so they were told to hold her on the bed. As it was, soon after the prescribed prayers of the church began, Eklund is said to have sunk into unconsciousness, so deeply that she could not be roused. According to the account in Begone Satan, the father had hardly begun the formula of exorcism in the name of the Blessed Trinity, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, in the name of the crucified Saviour, when a hair-raising scene occurred. With lightning speed, the possessed dislodged herself from the bed and from the hands of her guards, and her body, carried through the air, landed high above the door of the room and clung to the wall with a tenacious grip. Cat-like and diabolical, Eklund allegedly clawed into the wall, causing all in the room save for Riesinger to tremble with fear. With the effort of several people, the woman was able to be pulled down from the wall and returned to the bed. And so the exorcism continued. As the priest prayed, a loud, shrill screaming is said to have been heard in the room, and would not stop. They were unearthly sounds. Eklund was utterly possessed. In order for the exorcism to be successful, the identity of the spirits possessing the woman had to be established. After all, there appeared to be many of them. It is claimed that Eklund spoke with different voices, sometimes even in different languages. There were voices that sounded bestial and most unnatural, the Begone Satan account reports, uttering an inexpressible grief and hatred that no human could reproduce. Most bizarrely, Eklund is claimed to have remained unconscious for much of her ordeal, with her mouth closed tight. Even when it was open, there was not the slightest movement of the lips, nor were there any changes in the position of the mouth. It is claimed that the evil spirits simply spoke in an audible manner from somewhere within her, and projected their voices out into the room. Such supernatural sounds are said to have continued for many days, sometimes lasting for hours at a time. Then, finally, after an invocation of Jesus, one of the evil spirits possessing the woman named itself Beelzebub. Barking like a hound from hell, alternating between English, German, and Latin, the demon was quick to declare its hatred for God and obedience to Lucifer. It is also said to have explained the reason for Eklund's possession. Her own father, so the demonic voice explained, had cursed evil into her. As the conversation between exorcist and demon continued, it was revealed that ever since his passing, Eklund's father Jacob had also been possessing the unfortunate woman. Horrifyingly, he too eventually spoke through his daughter's body. And so Riesinger, in the course of the exorcism, came to learn of the despicable man, of how, having led a debased and sinful life, he had tried to force his child to follow in his dark footsteps. She, a pious teenager, had resisted his advances, and ever since Jacob had cursed her, wishing all the ill of the world upon her, inviting demons to seize her body, and after his own death, joining them in tormenting her. The sin of giving his child over to hell had secured him eternal damnation. Equally terrible was another claimed to have possessed the woman, an aunt by the name of Mina, who was also said to have been the mistress of Jacob. Her voice was high-pitched, and her words especially hateful. Indeed, it is said that her replies to Riesinger's interrogations were filled with such bitter hatred and spite that they far surpassed all that had happened so far. According to the account of the exorcism, she would also take control of Eklund's body so as to spit at the priest, and even vomit, with one shocking description detailing how the woman would expel horrific fluids in quantities that were, humanely speaking, impossible to lodge in a normal being. Even then, the worst was yet to come. The reason for Mina's damnation, the evil spirit claimed, was infanticide. Little ones, she said bitterly, had suffered at her hand. They were her own children, and after being pursued by Riesinger, she confessed to having disposed of 6 of them. In death and damnation, it was now her aim to drive her niece to a similar horrific end. Looking at the 1934 pamphlet, which is now largely lost to time, having been censored by the church, one uncovers more disturbing details about Mina and her relationship with Eklund. The woman was allegedly known among the people as a witch, with it being rumoured that she bewitched herbs so as to induce her niece's demonic possession. She and Jacob, so it was suggested, worked together to destroy the young woman's soul. Decades later, both now dead, they were still determined to complete their malevolent scheme. As the exorcism dragged on, Eklund suffered more and more. It is reported that her face became disfigured as different entities fought to take control of her. One particularly long and chilling description details how her pale, death-like and emaciated head, often assuming the size of an inverted water pitcher, became as red as glowing embers. Her eyes protruded out of their sockets, her lips swelled up to proportions equaling the size of hands, and her thin, emaciated body was bloated to such enormous size that the pastor and some of the sisters drew back out of fright, thinking that the woman would be torn to pieces and burst asunder. Throughout all of this, Riesinger is said to have persisted. Undaunted, untiring, and singular-minded in his mission, he continued to administer the rite of exorcism, even on his own. After all, it is said that the demonic presences were so strong that the pastor of Erling, who had been assisting Riesinger throughout, could no longer tolerate the friar or the exorcism. Perhaps identified as the weaker party in the exorcising duo, Satan is said to have turned his attention towards the pastor. "You will have to suffer for that," a demonic voice is reported as having said. It then went on to say, "Just wait until the end of the week, when Friday comes." That Friday morning, after delivering Mass, the pastor had to drive to administer the last sacraments to the dying mother of a farmer. On the way there, a dense black cloud is said to have formed in the road, blinding him and causing him to crash his vehicle just as he was about to pass a bridge over a deep ravine. His car collided with the railing of the bridge. Now a complete wreck, its carcass hung onto the iron trellis, threatening every moment to drop into the deep abyss below. Miraculously, a nearby farmer who was out ploughing a field heard the crash and rushed to help, thus saving the pastor at the very last moment. Aside from the shock, the man was somehow unharmed. All in all, the 1928 exorcism of Anna Eklund lasted 23 days. In addition to Beelzebub, her father Jacob, and her aunt Mina, she is also said to have been possessed by Judas and a whole host of other impish demons, both audible and silent. According to the text-begon Satan, the number of silent devils was countless. The exorcism's great length has been described as unusually long, especially considering how Riesinger worked from dawn to dusk. It should perhaps then come as no surprise that, despite providing immediate relief, it was ultimately unsuccessful. In the popular account of the Erling possession begon Satan, the reader is informed, on the 23rd day of September 1928, in the evening about 9 o'clock, that with a sudden jerk of lightning speed, the possessed woman broke from the grip of her protectors and stood erect before them. Only her heels were touching the bed, with the father calling for the fiends to depart and leave her body. A piercing sound filled the room. It was voices, many voices, repeating the names of the various demons who claimed to have infested the woman. Beelzebub, Judas, Jacob, Mina. Eventually the sounds faded away into the distance. Soon after, Eklund opened her eyes and mouth for the first time since the exorcism had begun. Smiling, she is claimed to have cried out the name of Jesus Christ. Satan and his minions were gone. And yet, as happy as this ending may seem, this was not the full story. For, according to the 1934 pamphlet based on Riesinger's own German-written accounts, Eklund relapsed into possession almost immediately. Her on-off demonic assault was still ongoing at the time of the pamphlet being written. Unwilling to abandon his charge, the aging friar re-administered the rite over and over, even commenting during an interview in 1936 that this case will continue until Christ says it is enough. After all, and rather sensationally, Riesinger had come to the belief that each time Eklund became possessed and was subsequently exorcised, billions and billions of devils will be locked up and unable to do harm. Today, there are still many questions surrounding this case. Whilst we know that something did indeed happen, and that an exorcism of terrible proportion took place in Erling, Iowa, with many clergy members attesting to the case's truth, Riesinger's desire to protect his penitent ultimately succeeded. Whilst there have been suggestions as to Eklund's true identity, with it proposed that her real name was Emma Schmidt, we cannot be certain as to which Emma Schmidt she was, or indeed if this was her true name. Alternatively called Anna and Mary, Eklund died in obscurity, presumably still suffering from demonic possession. Riesinger's report on the case contained the nota bene. These are not to be published through the press or from the pulpit. Discussing his case notes later, Riesinger had only this to say: I have not published a single word, nor have I asked any person to publish a single word for me, but I have sent a complete account of all that has happened to the Holy See. Rome alone is competent to judge. Until Rome speaks, I shall be silent. And so, it is only through leaks made by others that we have come to learn something of the demons who stalked Iowa some 100 years ago, with the possession and the exorcisms of Anna Eklund coming to define what we consider to be demonic in popular culture, and in our darkest nightmares. In the February of 1925, in the Talpa village of northeastern Romania, an 11-year-old girl named Eleonora Zugan set out to visit her grandmother, who lived in the neighbouring village, some 2.5 hours away by foot. Such a long walk for a young girl is undoubtedly dangerous, but for Eleonora it proved to be dangerous in a way many would not expect. On her journey, Eleonora supposedly found a silver coin laying on the roadside, and while finding money may seem innocent or even perceived as a divine sign by many, Romanian folklore teaches otherwise. For, according to traditional folk beliefs and superstitions, objects on the roadside or at crossroads may very well be magically contaminated, discarded by witches after spell work, or intentionally placed there to pass a curse onto whoever happens upon them. When it comes to coins in particular, it is believed that they could contain a familiar spirit that once belonged to a witch who desired to be rid of them, thus throwing them away so as to pass them on to someone else in seemingly inconspicuous places. But such superstitions meant little to an impoverished 11-year-old child with a sweet tooth, even if for Eleanora the silver coin that seemed to have fallen from the sky would be the catalyst for poltergeist phenomena that would torment her and terrify those around her for the next 2 years, and eventually cause her to be known and remembered as the Devil's Girl. Upon arriving in her grandmother's village, little Eleanora spent the money she found on the roadside on sweets, which she ate all by herself. Her cousin, who was also visiting her grandmother at the time, became very upset that Eleanora did not share the sweets with her, and so the two girls began quarreling. Hearing the heated argument, their grandmother, who was 105 years old and reputedly a witch, intervened and told Eleanora that the sweets had been bought with money left by the devil, and that by eating them she had swallowed the devil too, thus she would never more be free of him. The very next day, poltergeist phenomena began, targeting and surrounding Eleanora, with some locals even suggesting that it was her own grandmother who had cursed her. At first, it was small things, objects in Eleanora's proximity, moving or flying, and stones being hurtled against the house from the outside, breaking windows. Unable to forget the roadside coin, Eleanora's grandmother became convinced that her granddaughter was demonically possessed, a belief which became very popular among the locals. As such, Eleanora was quickly sent back to her village, where just 3 days later, the paranormal phenomena broke out again. Supposedly, the phenomena at her home consisted of strange apparitions and disembodied wails of unknown origin. When Eleanora would enter a room, all metal objects began moving and heavy pots would start to levitate. When she would walk around the village, the waters of the river crossing the location would start to boil, and hailstone rain would then descend upon her house. Sensational and dramatic occurrences that seemed to defy explanation. Understandably, panic soon overtook the small village of Talpa. Several locals supposedly attempted to help Eleanora's father manage the situation and guided him to find help within the Orthodox Church. Eleanora's mother had died years prior, and he had become overwhelmed by the circumstance. On one occasion, Eleanora was taken to the holy relics of Saint John the New of Suceava, one of the most venerated saints in eastern Romania. Many miracles are associated with his relics, and so Eleanora's father and neighbours believed that they could also work wonders on her. But it was to no avail, with some reports claiming, chillingly, that the efforts only doubled the diabolical manifestations. Determined to find a way to help his daughter, Eleanora's father decided to take her to a priest in a nearby village, assisted in his endeavour by several neighbours and the schoolmaster in the village. After praying over Eleanora for 2 days and having witnessed a series of objects moving on their own, it became clear to the priest and those present that the phenomena surrounding Eleanora were the result of an unseen force. Thus, Eleanora was taken to the monastery of Gorove, where she spent 3 weeks being observed by the clergy and preparing for exorcism. Incredibly, the abbot of the monastery wrote a letter to one of the doctors involved in the case later, in which he claimed that he and several clergymen and priests witnessed over 400 paranormal phenomena, most of which were floating objects around Eleanora. He also described that on Wednesday during the Passion Week of that year, at 8 o'clock in the evening, a wooden spoon from the monastery kitchen, some 50 meters away from Eleanora's location, travelled all the way to hit Eleanora in the head as a priest was praying over her. That same night, as she slept, Eleanora was violently thrown out of her bed twice and hit by objects in her proximity, such as nails from the walls, sugar cubes, a candlestick, and a bottle. The abbot even went on to describe to the doctor how he picked up every object himself and took them to his chamber next door. Once the objects were removed, the attacks on Eleanora ceased, only for the abbot to become their new recipient. A pair of boots, a coffee grinder, a matchbox, clothes from the hanger, and a 20-kilogram sack of flour were all thrown into the door of his chamber. Then the light in his hands was extinguished and a pillow flew at his head. At the same time, Eleanora is said to have claimed that the force was hitting her, as if with fists in her chest. The abbot stated that the ordeal lasted from 8 o'clock that evening during the prayer session and ended at 11:45. The next morning he found 3 nails under the sheets of the bed in which he had slept. Whatever the cause of these happenings, the force responsible appeared to possess a remarkable ability to move objects. Not merely were the items about the monastery relocated, thrown and manifested by unseen hands, they were moved seemingly with precision and purpose. After all, later that day, 4 people standing in the kitchen with Eleanora are said to have witnessed a pot full of tea rising up from the oven up to a meter in the air and thrown on the floor, all without spilling a single drop of the liquid. Then that night at dinner, a pot of hot soup flew from the oven, this time spilling the contents on the feet of the 8 people present, with Eleanora, as if by design, being the one who was burnt by the hot soup the worst. A little while later, sugar flew into the lamp and then rained over the table. A glass of wine shattered, and on the veranda, a coffee cup and its dish shattered as well. The rather chaotic dinner ended with a box of lit matches flying through the open doors of the guest room and the kitchen into the grocery cellar, burning everything without fire or wind. Without a doubt in the minds of those present, there were diabolical forces at work. Further proof of this seemed to be provided sometime in the following days, when Eleanora was hit in the back by a mysterious coin. Upon fetching and cleaning it, the abbot noticed that the coin was 108 years old. He gave it to Eleanora, who buried it in the ground and put a brick on top of it. Finishing her little ritual, she turned to leave. However, after just a few steps, the coin hit her in the back again. Shocked, the abbot and Eleanora removed the brick and dug under it to find that the coin had indeed vanished and seemed to have been the very same old coin that struck Eleanora for a second time. The abbot, mystified, put the coin in his pocket to see if the phenomenon would repeat itself. Half an hour later, when the abbot decided to touch the coin in his pocket and verify that it was still there, he found that it had vanished, its new location unknown. Upon reading the varied and sensational phenomena recorded in the abbot's letter, the doctor sent his skeptical secretary to the monastery, hoping for an easy conclusion to the case. And yet, when they arrived, they, like the abbot before them, recorded a series of inexplicable occurrences. In particular, the secretary was supposedly most unnerved when the cork of a wine bottle that Eleanora had been holding sprung on its own, sprinkling wine into his face and causing him to want to leave immediately. His driver, however, was overtaken by dizziness for about 10 minutes thereafter. When he came to his senses, he supposedly attempted for half an hour to turn the vehicle around, with the car being pushed by an unseen force back to its initial position each and every time. For all of this, however, the most terrifying phenomena happened during one of the exorcism sessions on Eleanora. According to the accounts of those present, a lightning bolt manifested out of nowhere, shattered the stained glass window of the church and hit the priest leading the exorcism right in the face. Struck as he was, the priest had to be immediately transported to the hospital, for he was in a moribund state. And so, after 3 weeks, the clergyman at the monastery concluded that the exorcisms had to stop, not only because of the potential dangers, but also because a diabolical contagion seemed to have spread among the clergy, who believed that Eleanora was soon to be fully possessed by an inferior devil of sorts, and not necessarily a demon in the traditional Christian sense. Their fears were supposedly enforced by the press, as Eleanora's case became the subject of news, with superstition and skepticism coming head to head and giving way to much controversy. As such, Eleanora was committed to an insane asylum, where the paranormal phenomena continued, with it being freely acknowledged by the medical professionals there. In an attempt to keep both her and the other patients safe, they kept Eleanora isolated. Although locked in her chamber and constantly supervised, on the 2nd of May, Eleanora vanished from her room, with the staff at the asylum later commenting on the incident, "We don't know what Eleanora Zugan had become." In many ways, the happenings were out of control. And so the phenomena experienced by Eleanora was witnessed by many, and spread controversial, incredible, unbelievable through the press until her story reached Fritz Grunewald, an engineer and parapsychologist from Germany who was particularly interested in the physical phenomena of mediumship and the problems of instrumentally recording them. His interest piqued, Grunewald set out for Romania, enlisting the help of Kubi Klein, a journalist from the area who had written sympathetically about Eleanora. The men contrived to have her removed from the asylum and returned to the monastery of Gorevei, so as to observe the paranormal phenomena at leisure. Thus, between the 9th and the 18th of May, Grunewald is said to have recorded no less than 187 paranormal happenings at the monastery, with his shorthand notes today being revered as the fullest minute-by-minute record of poltergeist phenomena prior to the invention of the tape recorder. According to Grunewald's notes, the main locations of the poltergeist activity were the monastery kitchen and the guest house in which he and Eleanora were accommodated. He also noted that the most common type of phenomena around Eleanora was moving objects, ranging from the slow tilting of a large pot on the oven to quite violent hurlings of moderate-sized objects at or near people. There were also apports, occasional raps, and, on 1 or 2 occasions, the mysterious conflagration of matches. And, sometimes, a foreshadowing of things to come, Eleanora seemingly being struck by invisible hands. The phenomenon that Grunewald deemed the most valuable in his nearly 2-week investigation was recorded on the 15th of May. As he sat opposite Eleanora at the table, a small coin fell onto it. Eleanora had her hands on the table as he saw the coin fall from a height of about 20 centimeters. He sat upright, with his gaze deliberately fixed on Eleanora so that he observed closely. Supposedly, Eleanora shrank a little when the coin fell. As for Grunewald, he believed it was quite impossible for her to have thrown it onto the table, since she had both of her hands placed on it in plain sight. He continued to sit opposite her and watched closely for the next half an hour or so, when something came from Eleanora's back, about 80 centimeters above the table and 20 centimeters above her head. The object went away towards her left side and fell to the floor. He noticed that it was a silver necklace with a blue stone, a gift that Eleanora had received from Klein, but which she gave in turn to the cook at the monastery. And so Grunewald concluded that the object could have only come from the kitchen, as the cook was there at that time. About this incident, Grunewald stressed that it was particularly valuable, as he saw the necklace float over Eleanora's head in steady motion while she was sitting still at the table. It was, he could only conclude, inexplicable. Undoubtedly, Grunewald was left affected and fascinated by the numerous phenomena that he observed. And so, when he returned to Germany, he made arrangements for Eleanora to live under his supervision in Berlin. Sadly, he passed away only a month later, a heart attack having claimed him at only 41 years old. His plans had not gone forward, and Eleanora was left in the hands of her family until the September of that year, when Countess Zoe Wasilko von Sereski, an acquaintance of Klein, took her under her protection. The Countess, an Austrian of Romanian origin who was raised and lived in Vienna, was a renowned parapsychologist and astrologer of her time. When she visited Eleanora for the first time, she said that she found her dirty, wretchedly clothed, and thoroughly frightened. The Countess observed and documented the paranormal phenomena until January 1926, when she was able to bring Eleanora to live with her in Vienna. It is reported that the young girl adjusted quickly to her new surroundings and was pleased with her new and more civilized life. Now living together, the Countess was able to learn more about Eleanora, and not just the phenomena that followed her. She deemed her a bright and intelligent child that was, in some ways, emotionally backward, for she delighted in toys designed for children much younger than she was, perhaps because such things had not often come her way in her own impoverished childhood. During her time with the Countess, Eleonora was also examined by a nerve specialist who deemed her healthy and in no way abnormal, save for an unusual sensitivity of the skin. The Countess also compelled Eleonora to participate in mediumistic sittings and seances, which she arranged. But by all accounts, Eleonora was allowed to live a more or less ordinary life, with her attending classes to become a hairdresser. All the while, the Countess continued to document what she believed was poltergeist activity. According to her notes, object movements and apports were common and often occurred in good light, even outdoors in the noontide sunshine. She witnessed objects falling out of thin air and landing with loud noises, sometimes after having ostensibly come through closed doors or out of locked cupboards. On one occasion, the Countess made a note of an incident that seemed curious even to her and unlike everything that had been reported before, describing a shadow which glided down slowly in front of the window and not straight but in a zigzag line in one of the rooms. Thereafter, she supposedly heard a low sound of something falling. When she looked, she realized that a dominoes box made of iron had fallen to the floor, and while the box was still locked, some of the dominoes that had been inside of it were now laying next to it on the floor. Similarly, when Klein visited the two in Vienna, he noticed Eleonora standing with a cat in her arms at the bookcase, as a dark grey shadow came from behind her, passing along her right side and falling under the table upon the cushion at his feet. When he looked, it was a tin box that had stood before on the washstand on the other side of the room. On more rare occasions, the Countess claimed to have heard disembodied and breathy, toneless voices in Eleonora's presence, but any effort she made to communicate with them failed. Considering the shadow and believing it to be the force that was tormenting Eleonora, the Countess helped her to develop an ability for automatic writing, so as to channel messages from it. Yet, based on the writings, the intellect of the supposed entity seemed to correspond precisely with that of the child herself, and not, as had been anticipated, of some higher, darker, malevolent force. And yet, as time went by, it was difficult for those exposed to the happenings to conclude anything other than malevolent involvement. After all, whilst under the supervision of the Countess, the entity that was fairly spiteful to Eleonora until then evolved to become alarmingly violent. In the full-scale poltergeist assault that followed, Eleonora's fingers were supposedly pricked as if by needles. She would be roughly scratched on the face, neck, arms and chest, leaving painful wheals on her hypersensitive skin. She was also supposedly sharply bitten on her hands and arms, with the bite marks sometimes being damp. The Countess was certain that these events she had witnessed herself occurred under conditions in which fraud would have been impossible. Something unseen was tormenting Eleonora, and seemed to have no intention of stopping. On the 30th of April, the phenomena around Eleonora were witnessed for the first time by Harry Price, the prominent British psychical researcher and friend of Grunewald. Although Price himself has been the subject of controversy, following allegations of dishonesty based on debatable evidence in the unrelated and infamous haunting of Borley Rectory, his observations in the case of Eleonora Zuger deserve attention. After all, Price had seen Eleonora on 3 occasions at the apartment she lived in with the Countess in Vienna. There he is said to have observed object movements and the appearance of scratch and bite marks, becoming convinced that some of the telekinetic phenomena witnessed were not the work of normal forces. He claimed to have seen, in one instance, a cushion move off a chair when both the cushion and Eleonora were in his line of vision. Even so, he was less certain regarding the scratches and bite marks. Interested to study them further, he invited Eleonora and the Countess to his National Laboratory of Psychical Research in London. There, he was able to observe Eleanora for 2 weeks, a time in which she was mostly allowed to play with toys and amuse herself, while Price, members of the laboratory, and certain members of the press documented the phenomena. According to reports, the object movements and apports diminished, with some even stating that there had been 1 or 2 possible attempts at cheating by Eleanora. Nonetheless, Price and the Laboratory Council concluded that under scientific test conditions, movements of small objects without physical contact undoubtedly took place. In some cases, objects were even apported from fairly distant rooms in which Eleanora had never set foot. The bite and scratch marks, however, continued to be frequent, with the more striking ones being reported on the afternoon of the 5th of October under the supervision of 2 members of the laboratory, a representative of the Daily News, and 2 other witnesses. According to one account, Eleanora was tying up a box when she gave a gasp and moved her right hand towards her left as distinct teeth marks appeared on her wrist. Then, scores-like scratches appeared on her right forearm, cheeks, and forehead. Shortly after, a series of marks like some form of letters appeared on her left forearm, all rising to distinct inflammatory swellings within 3 or 4 minutes, fading slowly. They also claimed that Eleanora was under close observation and could not have produced them by herself by any normal means. Curiously, after Eleanora's return to the continent, the telekinetic and apport phenomena dwindled away, while the bite and scratch marks evolved, gaining the addition of copious quantities of highly offensive spittle. These phenomena were investigated from November 1926 to January 1927 by a committee established in Berlin, consisting of a zoologist and 4 medical professionals. Under their strict examination conditions and in bright light, they witnessed the phenomena manifesting on Eleanora's hands, as each of her hands were held by a controller on either side of her. The spittle that frequently appeared on her was also examined, and it was found not to be the secretion of her skin, nor saliva fresh from her mouth, for the latter was relatively free of microorganisms, while the substance found on her skin swarmed with the bacteria Staphylococci. They also witnessed Eleanora attempting to help the phenomena, which they deemed to stem not from systematic and malign deceitfulness, but from childish bad manners and prima donna-ish vanity. Eleanora and the Countess continued to go on tour throughout Germany for the following month, in which notable paranormal investigators observed the phenomena. Not everyone who observed Eleanora was so convinced of the paranormal activity. One of the investigators, Dr. Hans Rosenbusch, later publicly stated that not only he detected Eleanora in fraud, but he had also detected the Countess in helping her. Thus, a new layer of controversy was added to the case, with the Countess responding to the allegations in great detail, citing her own notes from the investigation. Although she instituted legal proceedings against him for his allegations, they were later dismissed for technical reasons. Even so, her colleagues, who had observed the phenomena for many months, supported the Countess, signing a statement to confirm that they had observed the phenomena in bright light under stringent conditions, without observing anything to incriminate the Countess. Sadly, there seemed to have been no consensus or resolution between the two, with several parapsychologists and investigators taking sides and attacking each other's competencies. And so, before too long, the war between rival researchers forced itself into the centre of Eleanora's story, with not much being known about what Eleanora herself was experiencing in the background. And yet, with the passage of time and the cooling of emotions, the conclusion seems rather obvious. Almost everyone agreed that, in recent months and at that time, Eleanora had been attempting to assist the phenomena. Instead of blaming her and leveraging her attempts to invalidate the evidence collected thus far, a wiser route would have been to understand that her life for the previous 2 years had been not only shaken by an unseen force that hadn't been disproved, but also dictated by superstitious locals, medical professionals, and paranormal investigators, each with their own agenda and good intentions. Certainly, at the time of the controversy, Eleanora was only 14 years old. Her coming of age was anything but normal. To some, both now and at the time, it is all too easy to forget that when dealing with the paranormal and those affected by it, we are all still human beings. In this way, Eleanora was more than a victim of whatever forces tormented her. The cultural shock she must have experienced, transitioning from her impoverished life in the villages of interwar Romania to the glamour of the European occult revival in the 20s and the civilized provisions of the West, undoubtedly had a significant impact on Eleanora's demeanor, and even instinct to sustain something that, although had brought her much pain, also brought her opportunities that she wouldn't have otherwise been able to access. Whatever suffering the bites and attacks brought, they also brought her comfort and care. Ultimately, however, Eleanora soon lost her powers, whatever they may have been, with the onset of the menses in the early summer of 1927. She also lost much of the attention that had been on her until then, and so she returned to Romania. In 2015, her surviving nephew told the press that his aunt Eleanora never offered to speak of what happened to her in her childhood, and that it was very difficult to get her to say anything about the case. From 1927 until her death in 1996, she supposedly lived a normal life and did not report any more paranormal activity. She married twice, never had children, and had her own businesses as a hairdresser and later a seamstress. Her family described her as good at heart, saying that they enjoyed her company and that there was nothing evil about her. The seeming loss of power and cessation of paranormal phenomena in 1927 left the parapsychologists involved in her case feeling validated in their shared belief that the phenomena were the result of a poltergeist emerging from her subconscious. Self-punishment, induced fear of the devil, and inappropriate needs, desires, and guilt that faded as she came of age. And yet, there were incidents that make such a conclusion seem hasty and overly convenient. The sources on this case have reported on events that, although not sufficiently explored at the time or in the time since, correspond with the presence and dissatisfaction of a familiar spirit, as is described in Romanian folklore. An idea that had been dismissed from the very beginning by researchers. Eleanora herself supposedly suggested as much when she explained to those who investigated her that she would save food to feed the entity that she referred to as the devil, either to satisfy its appetite or provoke it with bad foods. Elemental in nature and of immeasurable force, familiar spirits are believed to be loyal if treated well, and possessive if neglected. And when observed, they seem to act out in spite, energized by those who misunderstand them. Much like a cat, a form that such spirits are often associated with. If struck the wrong way, it will bite and scratch the hand that feeds it. Such a theory brings us right back to the beginning, and the silver coin which an 11-year-old Eleanora found lying on the roadside. Cast off, perhaps, by another who was desirous to rid themselves of the familiar spirit which tormented them. Whether Eleanora Zugan was a victim of such a capricious familiar, or her own subconscious, we may never know. For now we may only learn a single harsh truth from her story, that we are all but sailors in the unknown, and that we ought to be reserved in our denials of that which we do not fully understand. In the early 2010s, ground-penetrating radar systems, the United States' largest company specializing in the detection of underground utilities, was called to a residential property on Brownsville Road in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Their job was an odd one, to use their radar to scan the ground at the bottom of an old oak tree. There were no utilities to install, no construction work scheduled at the house. Their task was simply to scan and report their findings. And so they did, and were surprised to discover a man-made disturbance at the base of the tree. 11 by 6 foot, it seemed to contain 4 figures lying horizontally 4 to 5 feet below the earth. It was, in short, an excavated gravesite. When they shared their findings with the owner of the house, he was not surprised. After all, Bob Cranmer had long suspected there were human remains in his garden. Local legend, his own research, and over 2 decades of horrific happenings experienced by himself, his family, and the priests he invited into his home all told him there must have been. For certainly, what took place in the Cranmer family's home after they moved in December 1988 was anything but normal, and could only be attributed to something otherworldly. Restless spirits of the dead whose lives had been terribly cut short, a decades-old curse whose malignant energy saturated the very fabric of the building, and even, quite possibly, a demonic entity whose grip became so strong on that old monstrous house that Cranmer on more than one occasion was left not merely fearing for his life, but his soul as well. Bob Cranmer was 32 years old when he moved into 3406 Brownsville Road. After serving as a military intelligence officer in the US Army, he was ready to reprioritize his life. Married and with 4 children under the age of 4, he was granted a special request for hardship resignation after losing his older brother Gene in a terrible car accident. And so he packed up his life and moved his family back to Pittsburgh, specifically to Brentwood, the borough where he had grown up all those years before. Desirous to give his children the best sort of upbringing, one where they could ride their bikes to visit their grandparents whenever they liked, it seemed like fate when he heard that the owners of 3406 Brownsville Road, a stately 14-roomed mini mansion with leaded glass windows, big white pillars, and ornate woodwork, were extremely anxious to sell. It had, after all, been his childhood ambition to own that particular house, having passed it on a regular basis, staring across the large yard with fascination as a boy. And so he jumped at the chance, arranging a viewing and having his first offer accepted straight away by the couple who owned it. And yet, right from the very beginning, there is said to have been something unsettling about the building. Writing in his autobiographical book, The Demon of Brownsville Road, Cranmer describes how, when viewing the property for the first time, his eldest son, a then 2-year-old by the name of Bobby Jr., wandered away from his parents. They found him crying, his mouth wide open and his eyes squeezed shut on the first landing of the staircase. It seemed as though he had got lost in the big house, and yet, when they first heard his tears, Mrs. McHenry, the lady who was selling the house, raced to find him, immediately throwing her arms around him when she did. According to Cranmer, she looked around frantically as she embraced the little boy, almost as if she expected to see something. After asking Bobby if something had scared him, the woman gently released him, then told Cranmer and his wife Lisa that they needed to keep better track of their children. At the time, the Cranmers dismissed the incident, attributing Mrs. McHenry's words to her odd personality and reluctance to leave a home that she and her husband had obviously put so much work into. And yet, after moving into the property later that year, Cranmer couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to Mrs. McHenry's behaviour than her own personal peculiarity. According to Cranmer, walking into the house felt like walking into the inner bowels of a large ocean-going ship. It was engulfing, all-consuming, and everyone who lived there felt it. The children, so Cranmer writes, felt uncomfortable being alone at night in their rooms and would often sneak into their parents' bed by morning. Bobby had an especial dislike of his bed and would often be found fast asleep, curled up inside his closet with the light turned on. He did this so regularly, in fact, that his parents eventually gave up trying to coax him out and instead put a crib mattress in the closet for him to sleep on, a behaviour that he continued for about a year after moving in. And so, in Bob Cranmer's mind, there was undoubtedly a negative energy in the house. Even so, he tried to dismiss it, blaming it on the fact that neither he nor his children were used to living in such large rooms. Eventually, they would all acclimatise. It was, after all, his dream home, and the last thing he wanted was for it to transform into a nightmare. In an attempt to put her son and his young family's minds at rest, Cranmer's mother suggested that they ask a priest to come and bless the house. And so, reluctantly, Cranmer agreed, and invited his mother's favourite priest, an approachable, affable man called Father Victor, to do so. Room by room he blessed the home, the only exception being Bobby's bedroom. Scowling in the doorway, he refused to let the priest enter. It was no matter, the priest would simply bless the outside and continue on his way. There was no use in upsetting a little boy, especially since he was already having problems settling into his bedroom. And so it was that the Cranmer family began a new chapter in their life. A new house, a new job, and even, Cranmer tells in his book, a new car. Everything was fresh and exciting for the family, and yet it didn't feel like it at all. This feeling intensified when, planting flowers in the front yard the spring after moving, Cranmer discovered a small metal box buried about 6 inches down into the soil. Inside there were several religious medals and a set of rosary beads. When he phoned the previous owners to ask if they knew anything about it, he claims he was told, forcefully, to put it back exactly where he had found it. It was soon after this that strange things began to happen inside the house. In his book, Cranmer is clear to state that the first few incidents were more annoying than alarming. The light pool in the cupboard under the stairs, for example, would often be discovered meticulously twisted around one of the small screws which held in the glass shade of the light. It was too high up for his children to reach, and his wife, Lisa, asserted that she hadn't done it. In other areas of the house, specifically the basement, lights are said to have turned on by themselves. Cranmer even claims that a chair, which ought to have been positioned at his workbench, would regularly move, mysteriously and without explanation, so that it was sitting in the centre of the room, facing the wood burner. Upstairs, in the middle of the night, outside the doors of their bedrooms, his children would report the sounds of footsteps and knocking. It was inexplicable and certainly strange, but Bob and Lisa knew little of what to do. And so they laughed it off, half jokingly, half not, blaming it on their very own Casper the friendly ghost. Then, when their children started to report seeing a misty, black figure stalking the corners, corridors and doorways of the house, the joking stopped. Around this time, Bob Cranmer had begun to pursue a career in politics, being elected to Brentwood Council in 1991. This meant he was often away from the house, working late and away from his family. As might be expected, his relationship with both his wife and his children began to strain. They would get into fights more often, tempers would be lost all too easily and over issues that were really not worth the heartache. And yet his political career, so Cranmer reflects in his book, was only partly to blame. The disputes were simply too much, too frequent, too out of control. Certainly, after moving into Bobby's bedroom, a room which the family referred to as the Blue Room for a time whilst they renovated another part of the house, Lisa is said to have suffered such acute personality changes that she ended up spending 2 weeks in a psychiatric ward. She had, so Cranmer claims, suffered a mental attack, her energy being drained by the evil which resided in the house. An evil which, for some concealed reason, was connected to the Blue Room. Talking about his experiences many years later, Bobby has explained how the Blue Room profoundly frightened him. It had, after all, been his bedroom for 6 years, and it was in there that, so he has alleged, he once saw a Grim Reaper-esque entity that terrified him to such an extreme degree that he felt as though he was going to die. One day, whilst in the 5th grade, and so 10 or 11 years of age, Bobby was off school. Ill, he was home alone, his father at work, his siblings at school, and his mother at the pharmacy getting him medicine. He describes lying in bed when he heard a strange noise, something akin to the sound of bagpipes, getting louder and louder. As it did, the door to his room opened. It was at this point that something very peculiar indeed supposedly entered the room. It was made out of what looked like static or lightning bolts, so Bobby relayed in his father's book. It was in the shape of a child's body, but without a face. Upon entering his bedroom, it is said to have moved to the end of his bed. Thereafter, a second figure appeared in the doorway. This one was darker than the last, much darker in fact. Tall, dressed in a black hooded robe, with one hand extending out from the fabric, it ran past the door. When Bobby, in fear, dragged his blankets over his head, they were supposedly ripped away, revealing another figure again. Floating above him, bright and faceless, it caused him to scream and squeeze his eyes shut until his mother returned home. Of course, it is very easy to attribute this childhood experience to illness. Bedbound and in need of medication, Bobby may have had a fever which could have provoked hallucinations. Although frightening, such sensory experiences while sick are not impossible. And yet, taken alongside everything else that is alleged to have occurred in the Brownsville Road house, it can be said to be a somewhat of a pedantic point to make. After all, as the happenings continued to escalate, the family invited others to come and bear witness. By early 2004, when the activity is said to have become entirely unhinged, with regular sightings, sounds and even smells, including that of burning sulfur, being experienced in the house, this included two Passionist priests, Father Ed Moran and Michael Salvagna. In their opinion, the Cramner family were experiencing demonic infestation. Father Ed was the first of the two men to become involved. Describing himself as not really an expert in deliverance work, he nonetheless promised to do what he could, and subsequently visited the home to celebrate Mass with the family and perform prayers of expulsion. The very next day, picture frames across the house had been disturbed. Then, in the days after, other furniture was supposedly moved. The taps on the bath were opened, causing the tub to overflow. Clocks and watches were stopped. Electrical appliances, including the coffee maker and the toaster, broke. Plugs were pulled from electrical sockets, and both computers in the house were constantly going haywire. The situation was fast escalating out of control, most especially when, so claimed Bobby and his then girlfriend, who was with him in his bedroom at the time, a CD flew across the room, slamming into a wall and exploding into several jagged pieces. It had barely missed the young man's head. 1 inch closer, it might have done him serious injury. For all of this, there was no explanation, except perhaps what the priest had told them, that there was a demon spirit, possessive and aggressive, in the house. Before too long, a second priest became involved. His name was Father Michael Salvagna. Although not an official exorcist, he had over the years acquired a reputation for deliverance work, and so, arriving at the house in February 2004, his arrival signified a shift in the Cramner case. What follows in Bob Cranmer's book can only be described as acutely terrifying. Confronted head-on, the entity claimed to reside in the house is said to have become bolder, more aggressive, and more intent on achieving its purpose of utterly disrupting and destroying the Cramner family. Not merely did the relationships between different members of the family continue to decline, with Bob openly admitting that he and Lisa came close to divorce on several occasions, they also found themselves at war with their own selves. In an echo of Lisa's mental breakdown years before, both Bobby and another of the couple's sons, Charlie, attempted to take their own lives, earning them stays in Western Psychiatric Hospital. Everyone who slept in the home suffered terrible nightmares, with them on occasion waking to discover inexplicable, long, red, deep scratches and even bite marks on their bodies. Another ominous development was the discovery of puddles of blood-like fluid on the floors and walls of the house. Sometimes red and other times a rusty orange colour, it was also found on the metal threads of burnt-out light bulbs and, remarkably, 9 feet up the wall on the staircase leading to the upper level of the house. There was no way that anyone would have been able to deposit the sinister liquid there without a ladder. If it had been thrown, then how was it that the ceiling remained unsoiled? Besides, Cramner could not understand what motive there would have been for someone in the household to have done it. and so, unexplained, the liquid continued to appear for weeks and smelt, according to Lisa, like amniotic fluid. Wet and dripping, it, in Bob Cranmer's own words, looked as if the walls were bleeding. As the activity in the house intensified, Father Michael continued to visit and perform Mass, praying, blessing, and invoking the name and power of God and Jesus in order to drive the infestation from the home. As little as it seemed to be working, the family were told to expect it to get worse before it got better. The entity's reaction to their assaults was merely an increased effort on its part to make them stop, and thus intimidate them into capitulation. And so it was that yet another priest got involved. Described as the right-hand man of the bishop, Father Ron Lengwin was the spokesman for the diocese and had been asked to help the family after one of Cranmer's political friends, who knew of his situation, called the bishop on his behalf. For reasons which Cranmer did not understand at the time, Father Ron never once visited the family home on Brownsville Road, and instead aided and instructed the family via telephone. At this point, the story becomes not merely more complicated, but more fantastical, but then also perhaps not. For if one is to believe in darkness, then one must equally believe in the light which makes it so, for certainly one cannot exist without the other. In this way, it is said by both Bob Cranmer and Father Ron, who has spoken publicly about the case in the years since, that a Christian mystic began to advise on the case. Her name was Connie Valenti. A woman by then in her 70s, she had, after aiding the police with a serious investigation, experienced backlash in the past, and as such had no desire for publicity. And so, a longtime friend of Father Ron, her involvement was kept secret from the Cranmer family until many years later. The insights that she was able to give allegedly came through extraordinary visions, something which, in a 2019 interview with the Catholic news website Spirit Daily, Father Ron described as spiritual knowledge given to her by God so as to help people. She was able, so we are told, to envision the interior of the Brownsville Road house without ever having been there, and thus view the spiritual presences inside. With such knowledge, she was able to offer advice to the family, which was given to them via the medium of Father Ron. In parapsychology, such an ability is referred to as remote viewing or clairvoyance. From a religious perspective, it is mysticism. Amongst many things, Valenti via Father Ron told the Cranmers to cover a particular mirror in the house with a cloth. She also said that Bob should go through the house, room by room, throwing a small pinch of salt in every corner, including the entrances. As he did this, he was to repeat, "You are to leave this house, leave my family alone, and go back to where you came from." Other prayers were also recommended, all the while Father Michael continued to perform Mass for the family. Still, the activity worsened, and so by the summer of 2004, it was startlingly usual for Bob Cranmer to wake in the mornings covered in scratches. Long red marks which ran like 3 claws from his neck down to his chest. Others in the house experienced this also, including his wife Lisa, who is said to have been physically pushed as well as marked. His son Bobby was even once so badly attacked that he had to be taken to the doctor. He had puncture wounds on his stomach. The medical professionals said that it looked as if a dog had bitten him. The family knew better. As the mystic Connie Valenti continued to advise the family, with Father Ron phoning Cranmer on a near-daily basis, some things, we are told, became clear to her. The evil in the house, she alleged, was primarily focused upon hurting children and mothers. The reason for this was, in part, because of a man who had been responsible for a tremendous amount of blood and more deaths than can be counted. According to local legend, a doctor who had once resided at another house on Brownsville Road, a house which publicly had a reputation for being haunted, had performed many illegal abortions in the 1920s and 30s. According to Valenti, whilst this may have been true, she felt a connection between that same doctor and the Cranmer residence. He had done evil things there, Father Ron related to Cranmer during one of their phone calls. Rough and rude and often drunk, the doctor was supposedly careless and made many mistakes in his work, taking no care for sanitary conditions and as such causing pain, anguish and even the deaths of some of his patients. As for the remains of the terminations, these he had burnt in the furnace in the basement of the Cranmer's house. For, according to Valenti's visions, the doctor had rented space in the house away from his own home to set up a covert clinic so as to be able to perform his illegal procedures. The family who owned the property at the time was suffering financial troubles and so had consented, providing the doctor with, as Connie alleged, the bedroom at the top of the steps next to the bathroom, the room which the Cranmer family knew as the Blue Room. In particular, Valenti is said to have seen the body of a woman in a white dress who died at the bottom of the staircase. She wasn't married, but had been sent there by a friend, an older man, a politician. She was put in a car and taken to the hospital. She also claimed to have seen another woman screaming in pain, besides a knocked-over pan filled with blood. Such would explain the blood on the walls, the smell of birthing fluid, and even the hooded, Grim Reaper-like robed figure cited so many times in the house. It was a house of death, and this had triggered the demonic infestation. On top of this, it was also alleged not merely by Valenti, but by many in the local area, that a mother and her 3 young children had been dispatched on the grounds of the property by marauding Native Americans towards the end of the 18th century. This act of barbarity was supposedly done to discourage continued pioneer settlement in the area. The woman's husband, so the story goes, had been away fighting during the Northwest Indian War at the time. When he returned and discovered the shattered remains of his family, he had buried them there, planting an oak tree over their grave. Combined with the later, blood-soaked medical procedures said to have taken place in the house, this manifested a dark entity, one which revelled in the suffering of innocents, and would seek, for as long as the land was occupied, to cause yet more pain and torment. It has also been suggested that all of this was exacerbated by a curse placed upon the house when it was built. One of the labourers working on the property is said to have coveted the young wife of the owner. When she did not respond to his advances, he cursed her, her husband, and indeed the very house which would shelter their marriage. And so, according to Bob Cranmer and indeed many others involved in the case, there were several reasons why the house was as it was. Such a sentiment was allegedly shared by the property's previous owners, most memorably in the odd behaviours of the McHenrys, the couple from whom the Cranmers had purchased the property. It is said that when Bob phoned in an attempt to arrange to meet up so as to talk explicitly about the activity in the house, Mr. McHenry became nervous and hung up. Another who had previously resided in the house, the by then elderly daughter of the man who took possession of the property in 1941, is said to have been more forthcoming. Cranmer describes a meeting with her during which she confirmed that she had experienced something of a spiritual nature in the house. Reportedly, during a housewarming party, a terrible racket had been heard upstairs. Slamming doors, pounding on the walls, and furniture moving about. No one was supposed to be up there, and despite the entire party searching the entire house, no intruder could be found. It was suggested that such inexplicable happenings soon became a regular occurrence for the lady and her family. That the house was a hotbed of paranormal activity was also confirmed by researchers from the Penn State Paranormal Research Society. Comprising students from Pennsylvania State University, the group was invited to Brownsville Road by the Cranmers in early 2005. Acting on the advice of Father Ron, it was hoped that they could, a third party with no ties to the diocese, provide the verification required so as to petition the church to send a trained exorcist to the property. It was, after all, by that point, becoming increasingly obvious that the prayers and advice of Father Ron and Connie Valenti, in combination with the deliverance prayers of Father Michael, were not enough to shake the demonic entity from the house. And so, in late January, the paranormal group arrived. In total, they visited the house on Brownsville Road twice. Each time, they are said to have experienced profound paranormal activity, with one member, Adam Bly, described as the group's instructor and advisor, supposedly being scratched on the forehead. Blood, so Bob Cramner informs us in his book, ran down Bly's face, with others in the group witnessing it as it happened. They also detected temperature anomalies and experienced equipment malfunctions. Perhaps the most intriguing and indeed chilling discovery that the paranormal group made whilst at the Cramner's house, however, was that of a secret space, a hidden spot in the centre of the house that only became accessible after Cranmer cut through the wall inside the cupboard under the stairs. On the other side, he and the researchers found a small L-shaped area. Filled with black coal dust, it is said to have housed various objects. A palm-sized amber stone, the complete skeleton of a small bird, 3 playing cards, some of his son's old Lego toys, and a crumpled piece of paper. When laid flat, the paper revealed 2 hand-drawn sketches, one on the front and one on the back. The front was a simple, idyllic image that seemed to be the view from the back garden of the house at sunset. The reverse, however, was anything but idyllic. A disturbing image of a cigar-smoking man being laughed at by another with a pig's head and a coiled snake. How or why these objects had ended up in the sealed-off void was entirely unknown. According to Adam Bly, who spoke about the happenings in a 2014 interview with Fox 8 News, the objects were indicative of some very strange, possibly dark stuff. Eventually, the family were able to get the help that they needed. The chief exorcist of the Archdiocese of New York, Father James Labar, arrived at the house in September 2005. Aided by a young priest named Father Ben, as well as Father Michael and Father Ed Moran, he led a prayer ritual designed to defeat the demon, bind it, and cast it out from the house. When the exorcist was finished, he warned the family to expect echo events to occur on and off over the following few months. Ultimately, however, he was happy with how the evening had progressed. As for Bob Cramner, he was, if anything, underwhelmed. He had anticipated something profound, thunder, lightning, levitation, something. Instead, there was nothing, not even the demonic stench which had, over the years, become so synonymous with the unnatural happenings. As the exorcist had stated, there was, according to Cramner, further activity at the property. It did, however, dwindle until Friday the 24th of February 2006, when a final mass was held, led by the ever-faithful Father Michael in the basement of the house. A dim, black, hazy outline of a figure was supposedly seen by several who attended. Intermittent tapping was also allegedly heard throughout the ceremony. Cranmer recalls how he followed the barely visible, smoky figure into the coal room, closely followed by the priest. Together they prayed, with Father Michael holding out his St. Benedict's crucifix as Cranmer repeatedly, loudly said, "This is the end. You will leave, and leave now. This is over." And so it was. The entity, the dark force which had stalked the Cranmer family for years, haunting their home and pushing them to the very brink of sanity, dispersed, with, according to Cranmer's testimony, the black misty figure melting right into the floor in front of him. After 17 years, it was over. As sensational and perhaps unbelievable as these alleged events are, it is difficult to stress just how well documented this story is. Hundreds of pages of notes, meticulously kept across the years by Bob Cranmer, led to the writing of the authoritative book The Demon of Brownsville Road. Not merely that, many of the case's key participants, from Cranmer himself to Father Ron Lenguin to Adam Bly, have spoken publicly about what happened. And this is by no means a hollow boast. Not merely are these figures clear and sober in their expression of their experiences, but also extremely well regarded as individuals. Ordained in 1966, Father Ron Lenguin occupies a senior position within the Diocese of Pittsburgh, having acted as chief spokesman as well as hosting the widely enjoyed local Catholic radio program Amplify since 1975. In terms of Adam Bly, he, after his involvement in the Brownsville case, went on to become a church-decreed expert on religious demonology and exorcism, leading him to assist at many dozens of solemn exorcisms, and even as an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists based in Rome to help educate and train priests regarding the rite. As for Bob Cranmer himself, as well as having worked in Army intelligence and serving as a company commander with the 101st Airborne Division, he also served as County Commissioner of Allegheny County from 1996 to 2000, a role which on multiple occasions put him into conflict with what he has claimed was the acutely corrupt local police department. A public figure with what seems to be a firebrand desire to do good and serve his community, many would defend Bob Cranmer as the very last person to seek to profit from a false story. And so, if you believe that such things are possible, diabolical hauntings, demonic infestations, exorcisms, 3406 Brownsville Road comes across as the place where this happened. Certainly, the Catholic Church seems to agree, with the Diocese of Pittsburgh possibly in response to the events that happened in Brentwood, now employing its own Rome-trained exorcist. And yet, despite the case's strong foundation of credibility, there have been criticisms, chiefly that, if not entirely fraudulent, many of the events reported by Bob Cranmer found their origin in natural causes and not supernatural ones. Indeed, it is clear from reading his book that his political career not merely meant a lot to him, but took up a large part of his life. Thus, it can be argued that, instead of owning up to the damage that his political career inflicted on his family, the absenteeism, the arguments, the strained relationships, the depression and mental breakdowns, Cranmer scapegoated the paranormal as a means to explain away the negative energy he felt in his home. After all, when introducing the Brownsville Road house, he wrote that its grandeur fitted his aspirations like a glove, with its stately appearance, 14 rooms and 6 fireplaces, perfectly matching his personality and ambitions at the time, with him always having viewed himself as a general or respected statesman. Not merely this, in moments of self-reflection, Cranmer explains how his own ego and inability to admit defeat meant he placed his loved ones in the line of fire by remaining in the house, in spite of all that was happening there. And yet, even if there is some truth in this argument, that does not explain the inescapably paranormal happenings said to have occurred in the house. The manifestations of black-robed figures, the blood-like substance dripping from the walls. Certainly, Cranmer went to great effort to ensure that these phenomena were well documented by not merely inviting several different sorts of people into his home to witness them, but also by keeping and cataloguing artifacts, including strips of the stained wallpaper, various bent and broken crosses and crucifixes said to have been attacked by the entity, and strange photographs of spectral manifestations. He was even able to send a sample of the peculiar liquid to a laboratory. Not blood, it contained mildew, spores, and disturbingly, skin cells. Precisely what it was, or how it got onto the walls, was never determined. Then there are the claims which address why the activity manifested in the house at all. The Native American killings, the diabolical doctor, the curse. In terms of the former, Cranmer was extraordinarily able to confirm the gravesite under the oak tree by hiring a company to use ground-penetrating radar. Their report concluded that their findings of a man-made disturbance were consistent with an excavated gravesite. In addition to this, Cranmer, through his own archival research, was also able to find a letter dating to the 31st of March 1792, which references the wife of a Deliverance Brown having been killed along with her 3 children. Written by Isaac Craig, the commander of the nearby Fort Pitt, to the Secretary of War during the Northwest Indian War, Henry Knox, it is suggested that this tragedy is the one which engendered the oak tree gravesite. As for the 1920s doctor, he too has been confirmed as a real historical figure. Records show that a Dr. James Merton Mahan did live on Brownsville Road at number 3233, with the wealthy pediatrician having a questionable local reputation. Whilst it is of course impossible to prove whether or not he rented rooms at the other Brownsville Road house, let alone if he performed illegal medical procedures, it has been said by, astonishingly, one of his own granddaughters that he had an evil, child-hating demeanour, with her early memories including having shoes thrown at her by him when she was just a toddler. Today, 3406 Brownsville Road goes by a different name, Grand Oaks Manor. It was changed by Cranmer to honour the old oak tree which marks the grave of the mother and her 3 children. The house is also known as the Brownsville Road House Bed and Breakfast, with Cranmer having converted it into such in November 2019, after his marriage of 37 years fell apart in the aftermath of the unexpected death of his and Lisa's son, David. And contrary to what you might think, the B&B is not marketed as a dark tourism location. There is no spooky decor, neither are there candlelit ghost stories or jump scares. Instead, it is presented as a charming and delightfully decorated historic manor, serving daily breakfast and romantic afternoon teas. Hardly a demon house. Indeed, in a 2019 interview with a local news outlet in which he announced the opening of the new B&B, Cranmer addressed the issue of the building's demonic reputation by saying, "Certainly, there will be people who come to visit the house because of the book, and you are welcome to do that, but I'm not looking for ghost hunter teams. We don't want mediums here to do seances, nothing like that, because we worked really hard to clean that stuff out of this house." As far as he is concerned, that terrible chapter in his life is over. And so, whatever you might think of it, the demon of Brownsville Road was very real to Bob Cranmer and his family. It was traumatic, chaotic, painful, and very almost destroyed his family. As he closes in his book, pure evil does exist. It can be openly and aggressively malevolent, but above all, it proves the existence of the divine. For without darkness, there cannot be light. Thank you so much for watching. I very much hope you enjoyed this compilation video. If you did and are new to my channel, you might like to explore some of my other videos, including the ones linked on screen now. And to those of you who have been following me for some time, including my members both here and on Patreon, I want to thank you for a wonderful 2022 and wish you and your families all the very best for 2023. Until next time.